All right. Good morning, everybody. It's so nice to see you all and to share Psalm number 6 with you. I am really taken by Psalm 6. It's relatively short, 11 verses. It's deeply personal and deeply painful. The most painful of the Psalms we've yet addressed. At the same time, it is the one psalm that that finds its way into daily prayer. That is, except for Shabbat. It's daily prayer in the Tachanun. The Tachanun are the penitential prayers said at the end of the Amidah. The Amidah is our communal conversation with God, where each person praying is a messenger, doing the business of the community, asking God to bring redemption. At the end, on a daily basis, it's customary to put one's head in one's arm and to lean down and to recite psalms, penitence, asking God for help in trouble. And it's deeply personal, it's done privately. And Psalm 6 that we're going to study today is a centerpiece of that penitential prayer, personal prayer at the end of the Amidah. So I'm going to first read it out loud for us to get a feel for the flow and the pain of this particular Psalter moment. And again, the question is, what prompts this psalm? Or to frame it differently, what would be a context for this psalm to resonate for us in our own lives? In this case, there are three possibilities in terms of the immediate situation. Either
Excuse me, Rabbi, can you put it up for us?
Yes.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Thanks for asking. Either the physical pain, so that this particular moment is one in deep physical distress. It could be another expression, as the previous Psalms, of foes, actual people, or what I tend to see in this Psalm, deep personal despair, clinical depression, a struggling to come out of an emotional state of feeling abandoned, asking God to be present. Well, that's context. Again, as you listen to it, just let the words flow over you, and then keep in the back of your mind, what is this moment? I'll then go through the psalm slowly, sharing with you the meaning of words and the structure. For the lead player of string music on the 8-string lute, a psalm of David. Adonai, do not in your anger rebuke me, nor in your fury chastise me. Be gracious unto me, Adonai, for I am wretched. Heal me, Adonai, for I am terrified to my bones. My soul is terrified, and you, Adonai, how long? Return, Adonai, relieve my soul. Save me for the sake of your kindness. For in death there is no remembrance of you. In Sheol, who will give thanks to you? I am exhausted with my groaning. I drench my bed every night. With my tears, I soak my couch. From anguish, my eyesight is dimmed, wasting away because of all my foes. Turn away from me, all you evildoers, for Adonai has heard the sound of my weeping. Adonai hears my plea. Adonai will accept my prayer. Let all my enemies be ashamed and terrified. Let them turn back, ashamed, in an instant. Benjamin Siegel shares again a wonderful analyst of the Psalms. And he shares the insight of a commentator named Samet, who, if you will, at verse 6, if you divide it in half, it's fully 39 words.
We're gonna try and figure out what happened to Rabbi.
Oh, I was going to say, is that just me that he froze?
No, he dropped off. We're gonna get him back on.
Okay, I'll put the video back on.
Hold one moment. Fixing technical difficulties. Thank you for your patience in this time.
Keep playing up screens.
You can see me.
Ask them if they can see
Can you see me?
We can see the bottom
Yes.
portion of your head if you want to tilt it up a little bit.
Call ATT. You're automatically entered to get a trip to
That's better.
playoffs. And a chance to join 4 fans to shoot for $300,000 in prizes.
Rabbi,
Yes.
the last words I heard was 39.
All right. Thank you very much. 39. I don't know. Oh, yes. Okay. Thank you very much. All right. Back on another device. Thank you. So verse 6, if you divide verse 6 in half, which is, for in death there is no remembrance of you. In Sheol, who will give thanks to you. There are 39 words, excluding the introductory verse 1. 39 words to the middle of verse 6 and 39 words after verse 6. And in that regard, it's pointed out that
It's working.
okay, good.
Just not that you can't put the
Okay, that's
text
fine.
up.
So know that in dividing it at that point, Samet comments that the first 39 words are directed to God, and the last 39 are about God, which will impact my translation of verse 10. I'll come back to that. Let me start from the beginning, analyzing the words, these painful words. The opening introduction, verse 1, the superscription, for the lead player of string music on the 8-string lute. Here too, we're not sure what these instruments are, but the word sheminit is 8, so it's often translated as an 8-stringed instrument, a lute. That seems to be the major instrument of the day, that of a lute. Adonai, do not in your anger rebuke me, nor in your fury chastise me. Now, underneath that is a concept that God is the one who brings illness. That's a classic biblical image, that God is the source and that it's often there as punishment or as a teaching. There is a concept in the Talmud called Yisurin Shel Ahava, afflictions of love, which is also to say that even when a person is good, they may suffer, but in order to teach them something. In this case, the Psalter is in pain, and he says, God, don't rebuke me in your anger or fury. And here too, you can feel the sense of a distance from God, as if God is angry with him. We don't know why, or if there's even a reason why. Only the experience of suffering and believing that God is behind all nature and behind affliction. And so he says, Chaneni Adonai, be gracious to me. The word chen means unconditional love, grace. It may not be deserved, but give to me kindness, for I am umalal, wretched. Heal me, Adonai, for I am terrified to my bones. Nivhalu. This word terrified will appear again in the final verse, in which that will be the condition of the Psalter's enemies. But in this moment, this word nifhalu is for himself. He's terrified. And it gets repeated in verse 4. My soul is also terrified. And nafshi, my soul, is that core quality of who he is as a person. And then he, in verse 4, va'ata, ad matai, God, how much longer? It's a bit of a rhetorical question. I mean, he's not asking God necessarily to answer directly. It's an expression of that pain. How much longer can I bear this suffering that I'm in the midst of? Shuva Adonai, return, as if God is away, as if God has distanced herself, as if God is angry. Shuva Adonai, chotza nafshi, relieve my soul. Hoshi'eni leman chastecha, save me for the sake of your kindness. He's not making a plea for his goodness. Rather, he's asking for God's goodness, God's mercy. And then this line, verse 6, which I'll focus in at the very end, because it's kind of surprising. For me, it was verse 6. Ki ein b'mavet zichrecha, for in death there is no remembrance of you. B'sha'ol mi yodeh lach, in Sheol, who will give thanks to you? Sheol is the place of death, the grave. But and I'll analyze at the end what is the belief in Psalms of the afterlife. But here the part that is surprising is this statement, in death there's no remembrance of you, and Sheol will give thanks to you, as if when you die, as if there's no consciousness on the other side. One way to understand this in its flow, and again, it comes in the very middle of this psalm, is, God, you want to keep me alive. It's in your interest to keep me alive, because here and now I praise you. Once I die, I'm dead. So we'll come back to beliefs in the afterlife, but you can see this is also a bargaining position. For in death there is no remembrance of you, and Sheol will give thanks to you. And now he goes back to himself. Not back to, he really turns to reflecting on where he is. And you can feel this enormous pain. Yagati va'anchiti, I am exhausted with my groaning. Asche b'chol laila, I swim all night, mitati, in my bed. Literally in modern Hebrew, eschel, lischot, is to swim, which I chose to translate, I drench my bed every night. Bedim ati alsi amseh, with my tears, I melt my couch. Or in the more recent translation, which will get posted after this is over, I translated as, with my tears, I soak my couch. So our C can be either, but it seemed to be a better parallelism. Asher shamikas eini, from anguish, my eyesight is dimmed. Atka b'chol sorarai, the word atik is to become ancient. Here, wasting away because of all my foes. Turn away from me, all you doers of iniquity, for Adonai has heard the sound of my weeping. And now I've changed the translation to not listen Adonai, which would mean he's turning back to God. But as I've been convinced in terms of dividing that, it would be Adonai listens to my supplication. Adonai accepts my prayer. Listen would actually be shema instead of shama. So this is a little different. Hence, I learned subtleties in the process of this last preparation. Let all my enemies be ashamed and terrified. Let them turn back, ashamed for even an instant. That was the way my friend Martin Cohen caught for even an instant. But in my more recent translation, I translated as ashamed in an instant, which would then be an answer to the question, for how long? Which he asked God earlier on in verse 4. So in turning verses 10 into the statement of faith rather than a statement of supplication, this psalm is equally divided between the first half, words to God of anguish, with the sense of God being at a distance, even punishing him, pleading for God's mercy, kindness, to return to him, saying, you want me alive, God, it's in your interest. And then so painfully describing his groaning, his crying, his anguish, his weakening, and yet concluding with these words of trust that God hears. You know, in the story of Job, when Job is suffering, the question that Harold Kushner asks, what changed for Job in terms of God at the end of the plea of a suffering person saying, I created the world, who are you to understand my ways? So Rabbi Kushner says, what is it about that response that seems to soften the suffering of Job and to create a transformation? And he would assert it was the experience for Job that God was listening, caring. And that was the most important ingredient. Not that the reality changed, but how Job experienced the reality. Viktor Frankl, the great psychiatrist, writer of the Holocaust, said, we cannot necessarily change the conditions that we are confronted with, but we do have control as to how we respond. And that pause in which we can reframe and choose how to experience is our power. And in this case, verses 10 and 11, after beseeching God and acknowledging God's graciousness, there's a sense of remembering and believing that God listens and accepts. And the last line, we're not sure who these enemies are, that they should be ashamed and terrified. That may in fact be physical enemies, those who, as in previous Psalms, are the soldiers or the government officials who torment this psalter. But before that, before the closing verse, this psalm I would entitle Utter Despair. This person impresses me as in emotional distress, emotional suffering. These are the words of somebody in clinical depression who is terrified, who sees no way out, and who's physically declining. unable to sleep at night. That's the other piece of verse 7. Unable to sleep at night, be it because of physical maladies or coupled with emotional torment, is now in great despair, exhaustion, weakening. And yet, what makes this a psalm is that at the bottom, literally at the bottom in terms of verses 10 and 11, is trust that God listens, cares, and therefore accepts a prayer. And that can be very, very helpful in transforming suffering into coping and being able to even heal. Now, normally I reserve the last 10 minutes for people to react. I'm going to change it up a little bit today, as I did last week with Psalm 3, because I wanted to focus on this middle verse. For in death there is no remembrance of you. In Sheol, who will give thanks to you? Because it's not what we think of as religion. All the more we who live with a backdrop of Christian beliefs, where in Christianity, salvation is at the core of the goal of religion, and belief in an afterlife is at the core of that particular religious faith. It's surprising when you see in Psalms a statement of no consciousness in the next world. So I looked carefully at this verse, and here's what I'd have to teach about the word Sheol.
Rabbi,
Yes,
are you talking about verse 6? I'm sorry.
yes, I am.
Sorry, I thought you said verse 3. Okay, thank you.
Verse 6, the key word there is Sheol. What is Sheol? Sheol is the word most commonly used in the Bible for what takes place after death. It occurs 65 times, 28 times in Psalms. It's a word that first appears in Genesis, chapter 37, verse 35, in which Jacob hears of the death of his son Joseph. His other sons have, in that moment, presented to him the bloody coat, that coat of many colors, now bloodied. And Jacob says, Ki ired el b'nei Avel Sheola. I will go to the children of mourning, Sheola, to that place of Sheol, which is to say, I will never cease to mourn until my death. I looked at all 28 times that Sheol is mentioned in Psalms, and there collectively, Sheol is grave. So here in verse 6, it's a counterpoint to death itself. For in death there is no remembrance of you. In Sheol, in death, who will give thanks to you? So Sheol here equals death. In Psalms, Sheol is used as grave. But it leaves us with the question, in the grave, or if you will, in death, is there consciousness or not? And here, Tanakh is varied in its approach, even within the same text. So that, one moment. So now I bring to your attention my book, Does the Soul Survive? I have a 20-page appendix that analyzes this more carefully. There are two possible ways to understand the word Sheol. It can be a palm, the palm of your hand, meaning empty, as if there's nothing there, or it can be from the word Sheol, to ask, as if there is consciousness on the other side. And you have verses that point to both of these possibilities. Here, listen to Job. A dead man's sons come to honor him, and he knows it not. Or in Ecclesiastes, the living know that they will die, but the dead know nothing. And likewise, as in this psalm, in Psalm 116 and Psalm 94, the dead cannot praise Adonai. It is a realm of silence. And yet, I started with Job, a dead man's sons come and he knows it not, also said, the shades, those on the other side, tremble beneath the waters and their denizens. Or listen to Isaiah. Sheol was astir to greet your coming, rousing for you the shades of all earth's chieftains, raising from their thrones all the kings of nations. All speak up and say to you, so you have been stricken as we were. You have become like us. We have the image of Rachel. A cry is heard in Ramah, wailing, Rachel weeping for her children. She refuses to be comforted. Now you can, in any of these cases, ask, is that being viewed metaphorically versus literally? But we have that story in Samuel of the king, Saul, going to a medium and having a medium, the witch of Endor, channel the prophet Samuel from the other side, which is to say, in the Bible, there are statements that call on us in each moment to ask, is this literal or is this metaphoric? What's the context? That point in both directions. Some cases pointing to a one-way street into Sheol, the grave and no coming back. In others, the spirits on the other side greeting the newcomers, as in Isaiah, or as the prophet Samuel, through the medium, addresses the king. There is a phrase that occurs 10 times in the Bible. It'll occur later, even for King David, that points to a belief in an afterlife that is more than unconscious. The phrase is, and he died, vayigva or vayamat, and then v'ye'asaf elomav or v'ne'asaf, and he was gathered to his people, vayikbar, and he was buried. That phrase, gathered to his people, in the ancient Near East, modern Bible scholars say is a phrase used for the afterlife as a place of commune, place of engagement, a place of consciousness. And those same modern Bible scholars weighing in on this debate, whether there is a belief at all in the Bible as to afterlife, say that that phrase, resonant with the language of others in the Middle East, points to a universal faith in survival of the soul as survival of consciousness. To return now to this verse, for in death there is no remembrance of you. In Sheol who will give thanks to you, is not a statement necessarily of theology, of a belief. Rather, it's a call. God, you know me now in this moment, alive before you. Keep me alive. For on the other side, I don't know. And therefore, keep me alive now. It's in your interest for me to praise you. I know you care about our relationship. And so when I reread verse 6, I don't read it as a statement of faith that there is no remembrance in death. I read it as a plea for what is true or what is known. And that is, I look to praise you. Don't make me die. With that said, it's now 10:30. We're out of time. But because this is so rich, I have a need to gain your reactions. So let's take 10 minutes. People who have only planned to be to 10:30, I fully understand. But I do want to give you an opportunity to react to such a painful, potent psalm, a psalm that traditionally was recited earlier this morning by people after their Amida. So I await in these next 10 minutes to take a few responses to react to. Please stay focused on one response at a time. Thank you.
Rabbi, I have a question more than anything else.
Sure, Barbara.
Is there, in Judaism, I know that we don't discuss hell very often. That's more of a Christian theology. But what about heaven?
So what's interesting, Barbara, is that nowhere in the Bible is there a distinction of heaven and hell. Isn't that remarkable? I mean, it's remarkable in the sense that it's so much a given in our larger religious context. The rabbis starting in the 1st century before the Common Era and moving forward, will say things like in Sanhedrin chapter 10, Kol Yisrael yesh lahem chelek b'olam haba. All of Israel have a place in the world to come. And the world to come will be understood as survival of the soul, heaven in that sense, but it doesn't necessarily get unpacked. In the Talmud in Sanhedrin, there will be lots of rabbinic ideas what this Olam Haba looks like. And for some, it's no illness and physical well-being, time of resurrection of the soul. For others, Rabba, it's simply 3rd century Babylonian rabbi. It's simply basking in God's goodness. That's the ultimate reward. And Maimonides will write in his introduction to chapter 10 of Sanhedrin that essentially he identifies with Rabbah's description that heaven, if you will, or a higher level of reward is to be an elevated consciousness who experiences this sweetness of basking in God's light, which ultimately leads to loss of self. And he, Maimonides, would say, those who long for physical rewards, the pleasures of this corporeal, this physical world, are only showing the smallness of their imagination, the smallness of what matters to them. And so in sum, there is no actual description of heaven and hell. There will be in the later Middle Ages accounts of suffering of people in the afterlife. How you understand that is another matter, meaning if it's just psychological versus an actual Dante Inferno. But no heaven or hell in Psalms, no heaven or hell anywhere in Tanakh explicitly. Another question or reaction?
Well, nobody's going to talk. I'll open my mouth for a moment.
Okay, go ahead. Thank you, Richard. Thank you.
One of the things that I wanted to comment was that I appreciate the development of the idea that this isn't necessarily a theological treatise on the afterlife, that this is David's experience of the moment in this particular state of mind and heart that he is expressing here. I was wondering if there is a set of events or an event or a set of events that maybe this psalm seems to be tied to, and I'll remute now.
So let me thank you, Richard. We don't know the set of events. Again, we're readers of a poem, and we don't know if this poem, which is another Psalm of David, is a continuation of the previous Psalms, which begins from him in Psalm 3, fleeing from his son Absalom. And in the last two, can be read as David appealing to the conscience of Absalom's soldiers, or those who are the revolting soldiers against David, or if this is another moment that's linked. And it stands alone as a prayer from deep despair. And the lowest point, I mean, here's another thing to know about verse 6. He sees himself as dying. That's another way to understand why he makes reference, for in death there's no remembrance of you. He literally sees himself on death's bed. which is why this would be prompted. So that we can surmise, but we don't know anything more of the context. And that is part what allows this to be personal. When we go to Psalms and studying it, it's natural to ask, what's the historical moment? But ultimately, the real question is, what is the prompt for such a poem? And in that regard, it's universal. It's not a particular time. And this is the prompt of deep despair. And it's so painful. It might be the most painful of all the Psalms, that it gets repeated every morning. And maybe it gets repeated every morning so that it becomes familiar enough that it no longer has its punch. It doesn't feel like such a moment of deep despair. It's like, okay, I heard that, I know that. And in that sense, it can give context to our own suffering, to go, wait a moment, one, my suffering is nothing like death's bed. And two, I'm used to being aware that there is suffering, and I'm really, so much further. I don't suffer all that much. So that's also perhaps its place of being repeated every morning. But it's so extreme. For me, when I just focus on this alone, and I wrote another book called Healing from Despair. In my 20s, I was a mental patient dealing with suicidal ideation around depression, which is the only time in my life where I felt clinical depression, that sense of beating up on myself, which I hear here. Verse 3, I am wretched. I mean, that's he's speaking about himself, perhaps in terms of his value to himself. I am terrified. I am exhausted. I drench my bed with tears. This is where he is in a state of such enormous pain that clinical depression is very different than the blues. We all have emotional ups and downs. Clinical depression is where everything just looks hopeless and you feel hapless, meaning no luck, where you feel as if there is no saving grace except here, God's kindness. Here, he says, I'm unworthy. It makes no case for himself other than, God, you need me alive to praise you. But he says of himself, I'm wretched. I am, I am unworthy. And so the words are always for God, chesed, grace, chen, grace, chesed, kindness. So this, to me, like much in David's life, whether it's about David or not, represents an extreme, a quality of suffering that most of us rarely experience on this level of depth. Let me just say, to pull this together.
Rabbi, can I make a comment, please?
Yes, please, Rochelle.
I tend to read dreams and great literature, particularly poetry. All of the characters are oneself. And there's this tension between doubt and reaching out to God in this. And I'm reminded, pardon my loose train of thought, I'm reminded also of the prayer that we say during Rosh Hashanah about who will live and who will die, and the number of ways that are listed as our death as we are living. And this poem, in particularly, in the one that we read about the boasting person enemy, just really ties this together for me. And as we approach Pesach, having to deal with the Pharaoh within. So those are my thoughts.
Thank you, Rochelle. Let me react to that and say that the Pharaoh within in our tradition is often called, it can be the Yetzer Hara, our own evil inclination. It can be our own conscience here as well. Or the Pharaoh within, for a person clinically depressed, is the beating of oneself, like a Pharaoh whipping. And it's this circular voice in your head. And I'm again replaying my despair in my clinical depression, saying you are worthless, you are, and then fill in the blank for negatives. And it's like that slave taskmaster beating on you in a circular way. And what cognitive behavioral therapy is about is looking at that tormenting voice and saying, but let's look at this rationally. Does this really make sense? Are you really worthless? Okay, you're not always good, but doesn't mean you're evil. And so here, as you say, Rochelle, correctly, for me, and that is, we read each psalm as if the voices and even the enemies are our own inner voices. And that is why this particular psalm resonates so powerfully for me. And to end with a positive note, even in this moment of despair, as you acknowledged, Rochelle, there is a sense of hopefulness, of reaching out, of feeling as if there is a source of creation who listens and accepts. And that quality of feeling heard allows some resolution and emergence from dark into light. In sum, the 9th plague is darkness of the 10 plagues, and as plagues, we as a people emerged forward in our lives into light. May we all be blessed to experience Passover and the steadiness of temperament needed ahead as being in the presence of God's light. Thank you. And on Tuesday, I look to meet again.
It was excellent. Thank you, Rabbi.
You're welcome. You.